Welcome back to P3, the Project Privacy Podcast. I'm Marissa Wharton with ActiveNAV, and if you've been listening to the show for a while, or even if you've only heard a couple of our episodes, you know that we don't tend to talk much about ourselves on this show. I typically only say ActiveNAV once in the intro, once in the outro, but today is a very special episode. With me are two of my colleagues, Chief Technology Officer Rich Hale and Implementation Engineer Jeff Dunning, and we will be covering data mapping as a service, and we will be talking a little bit about ourselves. So welcome to the show, both of you.
Hi,
Thanks, Marissa.
Marissa.
Yeah.
Welcome. I can't say welcome to you.
I am the host, so I'm already here. I'm welcoming you. But about a year ago, we had a great conversation on this podcast about data mapping as a service, or DMaaS. So with the launch this week of our brand new DMaaS solution, ActiveNAV Inventory, we thought it'd be a great time for a part 2 of that conversation. So as we get started today, can you refresh our listeners about what exactly data mapping as a service is?
Yeah, for sure, Marissa. It's been a big year. And maybe as a part of the update here, just to remind everyone that ActiveNav, our vision is that our customers can achieve zero dark data. It's a key part of what we're trying to deliver, the value. And part of that is our ability to provide an offering which enables our customers to discover, score, and map their data toxicity. It's a word I like, which describes sensitive data, and I think it's quite tangible across all their wildest user-generated data. That's the data which is pretty much out of control in file share, SharePoint, and a range of other repositories. And DMaaS is a cloud service which achieves that simply and quickly with a really very low overhead. We like to think it provides our customers a really fast time to first report. That is the time from purchase to when the customer is first able to explore their first data map of their wildest data.
Perfect. Thank you for that refresher. Now, last episode, you compared DMaaS to a Fitbit for your data. Would you continue using that analogy, or is there a new one that you've started to use?
Is there a new one? No, I think if that's the toxicity concept in the Fitbit, we talked about a health score. Concept really come together. I like to think about data toxicity building up in all this, not only legacy data but new data being created all the time by the organization. And as this toxicity builds up, it drags down the overall health of our customers' data. And we think about DMaaS as being able to generate a data health score. That's where the Fitbit comes from. And you could call it data toxicity. You can think about cholesterol clogging up the data pipes in an organization. These things all come together into, I think, a nice, rich picture. And let's face it, leaders are needing, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, needing ways to sort of help them get started and take action on data. And I think that the concept of data health, mapped with the new regulations out there and organizations' responsibility to look after their data, just like they want to look after their bodies, I think is a pretty compelling model. I like it.
You added a bonus analogy there with the cholesterol clogging up the data, so that's fantastic. Now, since we talked last year, there have been some new privacy regulations that have been passed or come on the horizon. So we have California Privacy Rights Act, CPRA. We have one in Virginia, one in Colorado. So we know there are several more pieces on the way. We know this is not something that's just going to disappear overnight. And, how are these changes affecting the risks and the responsibilities that organizations are facing when it comes to consumer privacy?
Well, I think for me, first of all, they I don't know whether to laugh, cry, cheer, or be
Maybe all of
frustrated,
the
because
above?
the way I look at it is that nothing really changes. The organization's responsibility to look after their data, whether it be for consumer privacy or whatever, I don't think should ever have changed, and really I don't think it has. What these regulations do, if you like, move it from a should to a must, which is the bit that makes me cry, because it should always have been a must, as I've perhaps mixed my metaphors there. But maybe I run the danger here. Organizations are now given a far clearer potentially more universal principle relating to things like individuals' identities, which are the key axis around which consumer privacy is built. Be careful to say universal. I don't want to give anyone the impression these regulations are by any means consistent in the detail, but generally the obligation to look after and ensure that one is not unnecessarily holding data on individuals and not unnecessarily sharing it is a great universal starting position for data toxicity. But as I said earlier on, there are other types of toxicity and a wide range of other regulations which all should be applying the same principles. Take HIPAA, for example. And out there, the legacy data contains so much more of this type of data. And so I like to think of this as not really having changed anything, although I'm very pleased that organizations have got perhaps a more of a reason to sort of move it up their priority scale. There's lots of really practical examples of what we find in our engagements out there that illustrate this case. I guess Jeff,
Yeah.
as our implementation engineer, has got lots of
Yeah, I
experience of
totally
those
I
sorts of
totally
things.
agree with you, Rich. I don't think that it's changed much. Of organizations need to, they need to be good data stewards, and I think the regulations maybe just kind of force that issue a little bit more. And really, what they're dealing with, it's not always about the data that we use every day. I think we're all kind of got our arms around what I touch day to day. It's the data we no longer think about, right? When you think about going into places and finding things like um, a payroll dump file that was used for some BI project maybe a couple years ago, and someone realized that it was just not something that was ever going to really be helpful. They walked away from it, and that data just sits out there in the dark, and no one's paying any more attention to it, right? It's the team site. You dump all your customer data in a team site thinking you're going to get some really high value out of it, and you use it for a month and it goes, it just doesn't produce that value. Everybody walks from it, and again, it just sits, right? And those are the things that really organizations deal with. And then the one that has just been out there forever is it's the ex-employee. It's that ex-employee created all this content. It just sits someplace, and we've all moved on. We've moved on from the employee, and what's out there, and those are the things we don't know. And it doesn't matter what the regulation is. I mean, it's toxic, and you have to do something about it. So the regulations, maybe it gets more people to move a little bit quicker, but I don't think it changes being the data steward that they need to be.
I love that you brought up data stewardship because that's something we have talked about on the show before, and it's something that's so important, whether organizations have started thinking about it or not. But whether it's driven by these privacy regulations, whether it's driven by the increase in data breaches, whatever it might be, what exactly makes discovering and protecting that user generated data so challenging?
Oh, I mean, you just start and think about it. It is the wildest of data, right? It's in most organizations. It's the largest amount of data they hold. It's the wildest, and honestly, user generated content can contain just about anything, and that really is the challenge, right? So they have this data. There's just about anything that can be in there. Add to it the solutions that provided some help in this area. They were heavy technology. They had a huge footprint to deploy. They were costly to manage, month over month. And then once you did kind of get it in place in that 3 months, 9 month project, and you got some results, you ended up with thousands of lines of in Excel. There was no real kind of like visualizations to say, hey, here's what you're looking at, right? Like, let me answer some questions for you about your data. That didn't exist. So you went through all this work and you ended up with a spreadsheet that 100,000 lines. Someone looked at it and said, hey, we're not going any further. Like, what do I do next? And that's really, kind of been the struggle. And then just add to the fact that there's just no policies. So organizations didn't have policies. They really had no way to do anything next. And that those are the challenges they faced.
Yeah, I'll add to that point, and I think of it, if you should boil it up a little bit, Marissa and Jeff. I think about it as kind of how do people act, and the problem with wild data like this is it's often in use. Jeff made the contrast between, or it has been in use and it's been lost, and you know, when you're poking around in SharePoint or looking at data in a file share, you're worried that you might delete something really important. And so it's all about the decision support that the customer gets to make the call to minimize that data, and mostly they're concerned about breaking something, even though the privacy regulations make it very clear their obligation to deal with the problem. And so, I think providing the people dealing with the problem the right instrumentation so that they can be confident to pull the trigger, either to delete, to migrate, to clean up in some way to minimize that data footprint that the regulation requires, is where I think it's probably the hardest thing for organizations to do.
Unfortunately, it sounds like there are a handful of pain points, so it's clearly not an easy thing for organizations to manage. But I mentioned in the beginning that we have launched a new product, ActiveNAV Inventory. So tell us, who is it for? What does it do? And what does it kind of bring to this space? How does it solve those pain points that we've just been talking about?
Well, of course, thanks, Marissa. You of course won't be surprised to know that these things are at the center of the inventory product. Inventory is really at the outset aimed at organizations who realize that their dark data, their dark user-generated data, hides this significant risk that we've been describing, and they're seeking to comply with both external data regulations. We've talked about privacy, but it could be HIPAA, or a range of other regulations, or indeed their own internal policies, whether for their own good governance or to protect their own brand reputation. There's a wide range of reasons why people would care. But importantly, they're really short on resources. They don't want a heavy deployment. They don't have many free hands. And I don't know all organizations are short of resource, but there are degrees here, And so we're thinking about organizations, medium-sized companies, perhaps up to 5,000 staff, although more is fine, who really haven't got themselves particularly organized with a lot of resource around compliance and data compliance. Um, it's aimed to provide those organizations a really fast start because we know that they're struggling to move the project up their priority list. And we talked about time to first report. Get a valuable report in their hands fast. And I think this is important. Jeff mentioned heavyweight deployments where lots of infrastructure is needed. They can be slow. And so getting that report into a user's hand really very quickly is important because it sets the great scene. And then in terms of reinvention, not only does the time to first report play a big part of that, but it also delivers proprietary scoring, which enables the customer to get this overall score on their data. We talked about health score, this Fitbit for your data across a wide range of compliance requirements. Show the hotspots and really let them get fast to the heart of the problem, so that they've moved from knowing nothing to understanding clearly the context and scope of the problem, and then really being in a position to take action as well quite quickly. Um, we take steps to make sure we align those results with business ownership, because it's really important that I like to think about pulling the tail on the donkey here. Whose problem is this? Who's actually going to go and do the job? Um, Geography, because jurisdictions are a really important driver in regulation. And repository, where's it stored? Is it in SharePoint? Is it in Teams? Is it in Slack? So you understand whether it frankly is ephemeral and can be thrown away, or actually it's slightly more important. And lastly, because it's a software as a service solution hosted in our cloud, it has a really low total cost of ownership. We're getting rid of those enormous overheads that customers are having to deal with, and that's the point of the data mapping as a service.
Now, you mentioned reinvention in there. Let's take it back a little bit. And if you could take us through some of those traditional forms of data mapping so that listeners can really understand that reinvention piece and why this way of this approach to data mapping is such a, improvement. I'm a little biased when I say it's an improvement, but take us back a little bit.
Yeah, traditional data mapping. I mean, it goes back a long way, and it started in records management and a range of other different disciplines, where you simply deploy a small army of consultants. If you're lucky, if you're unlucky, a bunch of record managers who are already in the business, and they go around and do interviews with people, asking them, what data do you hold? Where do you hold it? What you do with it? And there are two problems with that approach. First of all, it takes time. Maybe there are three problems. Secondly, you're relying on an individual knowing what the problem is, what's out there, and Jeff's already illustrated that's just not the case anymore. And thirdly, the minute someone walks out the door and the process is finished, the map's out of date. So those are the core problems of the traditional approach. I'd add one more thing though. People tended to only talk about business applications, things that are wrapped up in a well-defined process. We're talking about the wild data here. They paid no attention to that. And if you asked me to say what's on that server over there, you'd be a fool if you thought I understood. And so I think those are the problems with traditional data mapping. And so our aim is to apply that automatically at scale with all the properties I described to this wild data, and really really shed light on that data so that it can become part of the overall compliance regime, and we can apply all the good stewardship principles that Jeff described earlier to that data in the
Yeah.
wild.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So, go
No, I
ahead,
was just
Jeff.
gonna just add on to what Rich said real quick. That last point, that's really I think that's the big difference in what we're doing is that they never really looked at the content, right? They did the interviews, looked at the business systems, but no one ever really looked at the content to see what was in the content. And that's what is really missing in traditional data mapping is they never got that understanding of what was truly in the data.
Well, that's great that, they now
Yeah.
can. So, and again, I'm biased when I say that, but if we bring it back to inventory, this new product, in terms of procurement, deployment, the expertise required, all of those things that you've mentioned were challenges before, what can organizations expect this time around with inventory?
Well, I think the big thing right up front is no more heavy footprints, right? No more lots of software to install, big infrastructure to put in place, no more database licenses, no more waiting the, 3, 6, 9 months for results. Like we took all those things away. Inventory is a true SaaS offering. It was built in the cloud for the cloud. So, because of that, acquiring it is, it's simple. We've really put a lot of time and effort into being able to say, this is something I want to do. And within an hour or two, you're in your system discovering data. And more importantly, within, that same day, you're getting results back. You're seeing visualizations that's starting to give you information about your data. We have a really nice quick start package to help organizations. And the goal of that is really to allow organizations to get up and running, discovering data, in a really short amount of time and with very minimal effort. So we've done everything around that concept of time to first report. How fast can we get organizations visualizations, insight into their data so they could begin doing, the work that they're trying to do to find the data that's the riskiest, the toxic data and do something about it. So that's the big difference. We've kind of taken those barriers to entry away and really made it more about, getting results as quickly as possible.
Fantastic. Well, we typically wrap up with a question for our guests of, what's your final words of wisdom for our audience? And I'll tweak that question a little bit and make it more of a challenge. So, in 10 words or less from each of you, what should listeners take away from this episode? 10
10
words
words
or
or
less. I'm going
less.
to count.
I will say just get started. And my point, I mustn't add any more words there, I guess, but don't be frozen. Get the report.
I think
Love
I
it.
would have liked to have gone first there because I think Rich stole my thunder. I think just get started are truly the right words, but um, I think it's really about get results quickly with minimal effort. That's kind of what it's about.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for coming back to the show. It's been great talking with you about, the evolution of data mapping as a service and the new product that we have to offer. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Marissa.
Thanks, Marissa. Great one. Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, be sure to leave us a rating or review, hit subscribe, and tune in to the next episode of P3, the Project Privacy Podcast, produced by ActiveNAV.